facilitate unethical conduct, fraud, and corruption, and allow these to go unnoticed or unreported. Encourage all employees and other stakeholders to strive towards the promotion of integrity and the prevention and detection of unethical conduct, fraud, and corruption impacting or having potential to impact on government as a whole. And of course, these kind of create perception at times. We say that you've got a corrupt government, which we need to kind of put it aside through our action. Uniting our efforts as government, business, civil, and law enforcement agencies in the fight against corruption. Of course, what are we expecting as an expected outcome is government will interact, of course, with different stakeholders, with the officials, with the municipalities, deriving views on fighting fraud and corruption, improving ethical behavior and integrity in the public service. We recognize then that I think at times, those who are part of the system, they will at times try to beat the system. As more you put controls within the system, the more in actual effect, they kind of try to be ahead of the system. So it's important, how do we kind of work together in terms of now building a robust kind of a system which is enabled at times to deal with it. Taking those lessons learned, proposed solutions and best practices in the fight against fraud and corruption will be documented and publicized in relation to that. Not only that, action with proper action plans which deals with that. Through reflection and taking stock of the extent to which the current mechanism are serving the intended purpose, we as the Eastern Cape government will be able to go back to the drawing board to identify those particular areas or enhance those particular areas where our efforts need to be intensified as to create a culture that promote anti-corruption practices across the particular spectrum. So this is then a welcome note. I would say then, Singakula is a party and put them aside, as in order to engage on the particular section. Thank you, Professor Director.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Mr. Macheke, for the warm welcome and also setting the parameters around which this session is supposed to be unfolding, and also the key elements that all the stakeholders in this August meeting need to take into account in intensifying the fight against corruption. So without much ado, I just want to touch briefly on the apologies that we've received. We have received the apology from MEC, from Department of Sports, Recreation, Arts and Culture, the MEC for Rural Development, and as well as the MEC for Social Development. They've tendered apologies. I've seen the apology from the MM of Matatiele Municipality, as well as the MM of Buffalo City Metro, but he's represented by somebody else. I'm acknowledging all the mayors, given that I'm sure this is one of the first provincial sessions where we are seeing our newly elected mayors converging in a provincial event like this one. So I don't want to venture and welcome the political leadership. I think the Premier is more well positioned to do that. So without much ado, let me request the Honorable Premier to address the session and set the scene. Over to you, Honorable Premier.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Program Director. DDG Kwase. I might be struggling just to the call. I would stop the video. I mean, deep here, listening to have some thundering here. I hope that I will finish speaking. Allow me to switch off this video, program director and all guests. Maybe it's just giving me some serious challenges, yeah. Just bear with me, program director. I'm just trying to get my house a little bit in order. Thank you very much, program director. Am I audible?
Yes, Honorable Premier, you are audible.
Thank you so much. Greetings to the members of the Executive Council present, all mayors. I've seen a couple of mayors and executive mayors from both metros. The representatives of business, representatives of labor, the DG and all HOD. These our guest speaker, Professor Tulima Donzela, and the heads of our security agencies and heads of Chapter 9 and Chapter 10 institutions that are part of this. Good afternoon to you all. Program Director, today we join the rest of the world to shine the spotlight on corruption under the theme Corruption-Free Future Starts Today. It starts with me, close quote. When we say it starts with me, we mean that as individuals, we must take conscious decisions to fight the spread of corruption. As leaders, we have added responsibility to fight corruption not only with words, but through our conduct and actions. Colleagues, corruption talks to moral and ethical parts of our nation. The greed of the privileged, the few who are given responsibility to lead the masses of our people out of a dungeon of poverty, unemployment, and inequality is unprecedented. Abona bantu kufuneka bevuselelekile kuqala babe nezazela sithi thina bantu abakwizikhundla zolawulo. Ngawo ke lo mhla ndithi makhe soyikeni izinto esiziphathisiweyo ngabantu beliphondo. Sizikhusele kuthi nakwabo bafuna ukwenza ubugwenxa ngamagama ethu. Ndithetha ke le nto kuba sileli phondo we have got a huge reputational damage, serious issues of trust deficit. Things can be easily blown out of proportion that are taking place in this province. The cancer of corruption is not a new phenomenon. It was there during the apartheid under the dark cover of secrecy because there was not accountability and transparency in that era. Corruption cannot be a constant feature in a democratic dispensation. That should be seized with lifting the masses of our people out of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. The work of our Chapter 9 and Chapter 10 institution is very important. It is central in our constitutional democracy that we are enjoying in this country. According to the report that was published recently, an organization called Unite from Zanzi, entitled State Capture 101, South Africa lost 1.5 trillion through corruption between 2014 and 2019. When you listen to the revelations during the state capture inquiry, you begin to have a clearer understanding of how the 1.5 trillion would have been siphoned from the national fiscus. Corruption is in South Africa is a sophisticated crime that is run by a network of connected individuals who have taken a conscious decision to destroy our country for their own personal benefit. What we saw at the State Capture Commission is just a minor part of corruption activities. It is rotten in the boardrooms across the board, both in the private and public sector. The Competition Commission makes similar revelations week in and week out. Similarly, there are few angels in our land. Surprisingly and disappointingly, corruption has also engulfed the non-governmental organization, including churches. The rot is everywhere, and the stench is so unbearable. And we have all these challenges, and always in the public sector, because there's a public purse concern. People are beginning to lose trust and lose hope. Ide ibe sisiphelo ibe ngathi into elula xa umiswe ligosa lezendlela. Into kokuba xa ufuna uphuma apho ukhululwe funeka unyobe wenze intshontsho, and lo mnyobo lo usubona usenzeka naseburhulumenteni. Athi umuntu ngokusenikwe umsebenzi ngurhulumente ezawenza umsebenzi kakuhle ukuze abhatalwe imali yakhe, funeka ayonyoba aba bazawumbhatala, phofu abazawubhatalwa kwabona ngurhulumente. Yonke loo nto yinto esingenawuyibaleka, engunozala weengxaki ngeengxaki esinazo, nebangela uba i-corruption esithetha ngayo siyibone is-systemic in the system. So it's a kind of a challenge that we have to have a collective mind and a collective zeal and effort to really get rid of. The question that we must answer today is whether or not we are winning the fight against corruption. And if the answer is no, why? Public sentiment is that we are not winning the fight against corruption, and cases of malfeasance that are happening every day in our daily lives confirmed that the corruption is so prevalent and entrenched in our society as well as the country. I think part of the problem is that it continues unabated, as those who are involved are not held accountable and are not forced to take responsibility. We've seen this out of many arrests that are taking place almost in every day. It's difficult to get most successfully convictions because we tend to arrest for further investigation than to arrest for prosecution. We've made this call that it's going to be important that we look at those, and we must deal with every individual that corrupt the system, that is stealing from the public purse, regardless of the levels and the position where the person is. Prop Director, in our province, we're beginning to see action against corrupt individuals, and we're confident that this will deter others who might be thinking of stealing from the state. Seeing the action from the law enforcement agencies every day dealing with this, it gives hope that indeed, even those who are hiding behind will be able to be exposed, and we will be able to deal with that issue. The first thing that we have done as the sixth administration was to focus on ending the culture of civil servants who do business with government. This is where the rot started, when people were allowed to be players and referees at the same time. This disadvantaged thousands of companies who rely on government for business opportunities. They had to compete with companies that were owned by government officials or leaders. And we had to insist that HODs must mete out the disciplinary actions against those individuals who continue to do business with the state. We're seeing a lot of progress in this regard. For instance, in the Department of Education, where this phenomenon was rife, we identified 23 potential conflicted employees. 20 of those employees are in the process of deregistering their businesses, while the remaining have been referred to labor relations. We're also witnessing a promising implementation of consequence management across government departments. The case report we received indicates that management is holding officials flagged for financial mismanagement and corruption to account. People are now rightfully getting dismissed and demoted for their dishonesty conduct. We're glad you are winning the battle, but the war against corruption will take longer to win when something is entrenched in a system. It takes a bit longer to be uprooted completely. We've also introduced transparency in our SCM by publishing the names of companies that we have transacted with for COVID-19 in particular. We started this, and we have said not only for COVID-19, any service provider who works with government must be willing and must understand that that should be known by public because we've got nothing to hide. Not only the company, including the directors of the company. That's how we'll be able to deal, and so that we get proper business people who are doing business genuinely, not those who probably might be fronting for others. I'm, however, still highly concerned when it comes to corruption. We are still reactive when we should put controls in place to prevent it from happening. Other area where we are turning the corner is the strengthening of partnership against crime and corruption. As the province, we recently reconfigured our structures, as indicated earlier, to form one structure called the Provincial Cross-Sectoral Anti-Corruption Forum, which is now strategic structure for planning our anti-corruption programs. Among other functions, the forum is looking at is advocating the effective involvement of all sectors and organizations in the implementation of programs and strategies aimed at the prevention and combating of corruption. It also facilitates the development and strengthening of institutional capacity for the implementation of anti-corruption strategies and provides guidance on assessment of the efficacy of programs and strategies aimed at the prevention and combating of corruption. As the province, we are also of the view that our law enforcement agencies must be capacitated to carry out their mandate without fear or favor. We want all of them. We know the challenges. Some are limping due to the lack of resources, and we believe that this is an area that government must look at it quite seriously so that they do their work with perfection and be supported by all government institutions. On that note, let me record also my concern on how we don't seem to be protecting whistleblowers in our country. I've seen many committed and patriotic South Africans who blew the whistle on state capture activities, complaining that they have been left out in the cold with their lives and those of their families at risk. The case of Ms. Babita Diokara in Gauteng, an official at the Department of Health, was gunned down in August this year, should serve as a constant reminder that indeed whistleblowers always need state protection. But also you must go through and look at the whistleblowers themselves. Government must have capacity so that government is not diverted from the real corruption by those who still want to corrupt the system by being whistleblowers at the same time. Their cries and pleas for protect should not at all land on deaf ears. They should be addressed expeditiously by government. It is true that without the courageous act as whistleblowers, we would not have known the extent of the state capture. Government should develop a clear plan to take care of whistleblowers who risk their careers for the benefit of our nation. Siyafuna ukuthi sibe nendlela yokwazi ukwahlulela phakathi koSathane nengelosi, so that oSathane bangazenzi ingelosi zenziwe oSathane. I wish you all and your families a safe festive season. Protect yourselves and your loved ones from the COVID-19. We've just observed that our province is now getting into the fourth wave, following other provinces that are there and already are seeing such kind of numbers. This is a challenge that if we are not vigilant as we go to holidays and festive season, we might not see each other again come next year. We would want to see everyone back here next year, working hard to serve our people wholeheartedly. Let's observe our non-pharmaceutical intervention as the only solution that helps to fundamentally disrupt the transmission of this virus. Let's wear our masks, sanitize regularly, keep social distance, avoid big gatherings to make sure that we protect ourselves as well as protect those we love. We know we've got a challenge of the livelihood. Unfortunately, this is the government of the people, for the people, by the people. If there are no people and people will be extinguished by this virus, there will be no government or a democratic order in our country. It's important just to know that the life is a priority, but we must protect lives at all material times, but at the same time, preserve their livelihood. Thank you very much, Program Director, for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Premier, for setting a very clear tone and also reflecting on what the province has already started to do to deal with this scourge. We are really grateful for the outline of what we should be focusing on and what we should be improving, and not only be comfortable only with the advocacy programs, but we need to be more decisive in terms of taking serious action against the transgressors. Thank you very much, Honorable Premier. You actually remind me of the current head of the World Trade Organization, Ms. Ngozi, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who was requested by the former president of Nigeria, President Obasanjo, to come back home to that country to deal with economic development reforms, as well as deal with the perennial problem of corruption that nearly collapsed that country. She wrote a book sharing the experiences of reforming a country that is characterized by slow economic growth, maladministration, high levels of corruption, and all that. And she titled that book, Reforming the Unreformable. And he has got a chapter that is dedicated on corruption there, where she was threatened when he dared to confront corruption. Some of the people even phoned her husband in America to say, please come home and take away your wife. It's becoming a problem. But he stood firm. So I think you are also calling us to draw lessons from a number of other activists against corruption to really stand firm if we are to really make a difference. Otherwise, we are likely to go back to the levels where Nigeria was before that intervention of reforming the unreformable. Thank you very much, Honorable Premier. Without much ado, I'll request the Auditor General, Mr. Sabwele Mavundla, to share with us how we can better promote accountability, especially in managing the public funds. Over to you, Mr. Mavundla. Are you able to load from your side? Please unmute.
Program Director, please advise if you can see the presentation.
Yes, we can see it. Thank you
so much. Honorable Premier and all distinguished guests from provincial government, local government, and if there are any from national government, all distinguished guests, it is an honor to be here on this august occasion. All protocol observed. Please excuse and accept the apology of the business unit leader, as she is currently off sick due to this flu that is going around. Yes, so we have been invited to talk about promoting accountability of the state and management of public funds. It is something that is very close and dear, of course, to the heart of the Auditor General herself and the actual institution. It is built into our mission, which, of course, as everyone should be well aware, is to strengthen our country's democracy by enabling oversight, accountability, and governance in the public sector. We do this through auditing and thereby resulting in building public confidence. We also, of course, want to be recognized by all our stakeholders as a relevant supreme audit institution that enhances public sector accountability. So accountability is critical in terms of why we exist and how we exist and what we do in our day-to-days. One of the major things that we have identified through all our previous audits is that there are 7 areas that the government should really look at. We need sustainable solutions. So we can't look at just short-term solutions, which may assist in the short term, but actually alienate other results later on. And this, of course, requires time and investment. Specific attention must be paid to SOEs, struggling public entities, and key service delivery departments such as health department, roads, public works, which are critical in terms of the citizens of the country and what we're doing. And of course, local government is critical as a service delivery sphere of government. Financial management discipline is crucial, and we need to ensure that public money is protected. I want to just echo the Premier's statements, the Honorable Premier's, to say that public money should be protected. This should be the first point of call of any leadership. And of course, subsequently to that, there should be transparency and accountability in the management of state funds. So if anything does go wrong, we do try to ensure that we are accountable. We should prevent leakages such as losses, irregular expenditure, fruitless and wasteful, and we recover this money, or we should be working to recover this money if it has been lost. Of course, then subsequently, we always talk about consequences of accountability failures. It must be effective, it must be swift, and we'll discuss some of the insights that we've seen where we are struggling in terms of resolving some critical things that have been highlighted by the Auditor General. Of course, there needs to be continued support from the AG's perspective in terms of the material irregularity process, in terms of following up on those elements, and on the accounting officers and also on the authorities to assist in terms of resolving these elements. Everybody has a part to play, whether you are just an official or if you are an executive authority. It is critical that we see that everybody does their bit to move the country forward. So one of the major messages that we have seen, and as you would have heard from the Auditor General last night and yesterday, is that we are seeing some signs of improvement at auditees. This is a good step forward in terms of where we want to go, but we cannot yet see progressive and sustainable improvements which are required to prevent accountability failures. And we need to also deal with accountability failures appropriately and consistently. We also do not see the fundamentals being strengthened to enable strong management disciplines at all auditees. And further, if we look around at the interest of what is in the public and what we have reported on, there is just persistent weakness in systems of transparency, accountability, and performance. And of course, it's of significant concern to citizens and of South Africa broadly. I'm not going to belabor the point. It is critical that we do acknowledge that there are elements across the board, from state-owned entities, from SA municipalities having 26 billion rand in irregular expenditure, 12% of government SOEs still not improving, 186 billion vanished from SA municipalities in 10 years. And all of these are coming out, of course, from the reports that we do and the general reports that are presented. So these elements are factual statements in terms of identifying the items that are affecting us. But of course, we go over and above that, and we try to determine what is the root cause. So the symptoms, as I explained in the previous slide, are there. It's all in the media, the outcomes. However, we have determined that it all boils down to accountability when we look at the root causes. Either there are individuals that are not in key positions, so it's vacancies or instability, the constant changing around, so there's no one to implement processes and ensure accountability. Or if there are people, warm bodies in those positions, we do tend to see leaderships in action or inconsistent action, which creates a culture of no consequences. This is also due to inadequate performance systems and processes, so getting the information fast enough to make a decision and turning around a situation before it gets out of hand, which is a very critical element. We also see that sometimes leaderships do not take repeated recommendations, so we've heard the story too many times and we just don't take it seriously. We're continuing as if it's still a normal day. We also identify that if there are people who may be willing, who may want to do the work, however, may have inadequate skills, which resulted in lack of oversight or insufficient implementation and maintenance. So as you can see, we boiled down to 4 root causes, which all speak to accountability in its various and numerous forms. The recommendations we made for the last number of years on improving the different aspects of financial management did not receive the necessary attention. And dealing with the consequences of poor financial management is costly and time-consuming, and often reversing the results is onerous. So it's more time-consuming to go back and correct the bad situation, and so it just gets left undone because we see or we may feel that there are more pressing needs in terms of that. And so having looked at the context of the audit findings, having engaged with our stakeholders, having identified that all of these elements revolve around accountability and the other root causes and the persistent progressive outcomes, we have resolved that as long as there's no focus on shifting the public sector culture, outcomes and transparency will not change materiality. So over and above the auditing processes that we're working on, we have identified that the culture in itself has to be shifted. In 2022, we'll start on the new strategy extending until 2030, which aligns nicely to the NDP. The new strategy aims to shift the public sector culture through insight, influence, and enforcement. So you might have already felt the enforcement in terms of the material irregularities, which we'll continue to deal with, but over and above that, we want to provide more detailed and more insightful analysis of the issues within the public sector, and of course then influence the public sector in terms of their accountability before throwing down the hammer with the enforcement. Through our actions, the AGSA aims to impact and shift our clients towards cultures of accountability. We are really behind this accountability culture, and we believe that for us to move forward, everybody needs to get their hands dirty, and the call of action by the Premier and the HOD of Treasury, we are behind that, and we are willing to also be involved in terms of assisting in terms of our processes without, of course, affecting our status quo, which is, of course, auditing and reporting on the financials of government. One of the critical things we've identified out of this whole process is identifying what an accountability ecosystem is and who is involved in that ecosystem. So this is just a terminology which looks at all the stakeholders in the network who drive public sector accountability. And one of the key things that you're going to see from the Office of the Auditor General in terms of pushing accountability is a more in-depth look at this scenario here. So we're going to look at the combined assurance that is provided by the top level, which is the Navy, which is the leadership and decision makers. So your senior management, your officials, your accounting officer and executive authority, those individuals provide a level of assurance and they need to be accountable. This is of course provided by the legislation and other regulations attached to that. Then, of course, you've got other elements like internal audit and audit committee. This we had looked at in detail and we report on. Over and above this, we have identified that the legislation is quite advanced in some areas and provides for other support and intervention and oversight. Here we've looked at your national and provincial leadership in terms of the work that they do and how they're doing their work, the supporting departments, so your National Treasury, your Provincial Treasuries, your OTP, your COCTA, you're going to see a lot more statements around this, a lot more assessment of have we put in interventions, what interventions are in, for instance, the local government space, and what is the results of that? Are we seeing positive outcomes from the intervention? So it's not just going to be insights on just the financial statement. And then, of course, we're going to look at national and provincial leadership. So here we're looking at how we're going to influence these individuals, and then also what are their roles and interventions in terms of the system. And one of the critical things that we feel in terms of going forward is the expanded mandate of the AGSA. So over and above the insights that we're going to provide and the influence, we have since the 1st of April 2019 been given a mechanism to strengthen accountability. And we believe that by utilizing this in such a way that the public understands what is going on, and if there are any recourse, then it's important that we implement that. In the end, it's important to note that our expanded powers do not change the roles and responsibilities of the accounting officers and authorities, executive authorities, and oversight bodies. This is just an additional mechanism that has come up from our experience in terms of working in the financial sector sphere of government. So it's important that accounting officers and authorities still have the responsibility to prevent irregularities and to take action when it occurs. We only use our expanded mandate when we detect and report on that MI and when no action has been taken. And so currently we have implemented the MI process at 146 auditees in the 2019-20 cycle, which was an improvement from the 25 in the 2018-19 cycle. And we'll discuss some of those interesting findings that should hone in for the leadership to say, these are the elements that we need to improve on. Surprisingly, there are no surprises, or there shouldn't be any surprises in terms of what we report, because we have been talking about these elements. We have expanded the MI definition to include non-compliance with or contravention of legislation. We're also looking at fraud, as that is a big element that has come up through, and we have some examples within the province that we have identified. We're looking at theft or breach of fiduciary duty that resulted or will result in a material financial loss. When we talk about a financial loss, we're talking about a monetary element that will result in the loss. Of course, we want to phase in the implementation at all of our auditees. We plan to do this by 2022-2023 financial cycle. However, this does not limit the auditors in utilizing our powers. It is in legislation. If at an auditee where it's not phased in, there is an MI that is identified, this will be escalated and reported as such. It is critical that we do what we're supposed to be doing so that we don't get into this entanglement, as it were. So what have we found so far? Okay, this is a picture of looking at all the MIs across the country. As of 15 October 2021, we've identified 237 MIs. Only 17 MIs have been closed since we started implementing this, which means that there are 220 MIs which remain unresolved. And this is where the concern comes in, is that these irregularities are identified and then they never get out of the system. And so that is something we will be pushing in terms of what we want to look at. If you look at it, we've got 6 key areas where the remaining MIs are. Procurement, there's a lot in procurement, 37, which relates to non-compliance. We did expect that. That is not too much of a surprise. In terms of payments, the concern there is that we're paying for goods or services not received, or if we've paid, the quality of the goods or services are not in line with the contract. And of course, at the end of the day, there are processes that are in place, but these are not being utilized by the staff. And this is, of course, where the breakdown of those controls, preventative controls, and accountability should be kicking in. And then, of course, there are payments. We know the struggle of this, not made on time, which results in interest, standing times, and penalties, which make up 53. Interestingly, there have been 2 suspected fraud cases resulting in financial loss. One of those 2, as indicated, is in the Eastern Cape. However, it must be noted with that example that the auditee had identified it, had implemented processes to address it, and at this moment we're assessing if those processes are adequate. So it's important to even understand that there are employees within the system who may not believe in the public service mandate, and maybe they're just to take advantage and may see an opportunity and deal with it. With revenue management, we struggle with revenue not being billed. We've seen this in some of our municipalities, and we also struggle in terms of recovering debt. We also have a fixed focus on disclaimers, especially repeat disclaimers, where we have identified 22, which could result in substantial harms. Either there's a lack of service delivery, or the municipality is in a vulnerable financial position. And so we're pushing that those municipalities, there needs to be a focus on them to get them out of that situation so that the public can actually experience services. Just to highlight, these matters are not limited to one area. As you can see, they're cross-board. They're not new or complex, so we haven't yet found things that would require the expertise of forensic auditors and such. most of these have arisen as a result of weak internal controls and predominantly related to the SCM and payment sphere. And of course, critically, these matters impact the lives of citizens. If we're getting goods, if we're paying for goods that we don't receive, we cannot then provide the services. If we're procuring over prices, it means the economies of scale are not working. We cannot provide as many services. If we do not get revenue, we cannot be sustainable. And that also has impact on how to operate, as I'm sure the local government officials and leadership, political leadership, will be able to tell you it is a crisis and there is something that needs to be done. So now that I've highlighted some of these issues, what are the next steps and what are the responsibilities? It is critical to note that executive and oversights have a role to play where we've identified an MI. There needs to be follow-up to say that, well, have we dealt with this appropriately? If we haven't, what are our plans to deal with it? And then follow up that it gets implemented. Of course, the Auditor General will also come in terms of following up. If the outcome were not reasonable, that's when the more punitive measures come in, which is the hammer, as I like to refer to it, which is a referral or a recommendation in the audit report. So if we refer, we can refer to any public body to do an investigation, whether it's a public protector, whether it's the Hawks, whether it's SAPS, we can refer to the NPA, any public body to look into this particular matter. We'll work in conjunction with them to get a resolution, or we put a recommendation in the audit report. If the recommendation is not performed within a certain time, then that results in a certificate of debt. The certificate of debt, of course, is in the accounting officer or the accounting authority's name, and we feel that that then pushes action because they will be personally liable for this. And of course, with the personal liability comes a lot of anxiety, but if we do what we're supposed to do, we never need to get to that situation. And of course, that is also why we encourage the executives and oversight to monitor progress, support accounting officer in implementing recommendations and improving controls, and being aware of where we stand in those processes. So we have also identified in 2030 what our success will look like. We, of course, want better accountability. We want the public to know that even if there is a leakage or a loss, they trust that their leadership will recover their money and that individual will be punished. We want to also talk about protection of resources. There must be a kind of jealous protection of resources. We've been given this awesome responsibility to do something that not a lot of people had thought 20 years down the line we can do. So we need to make sure that we protect the resources and utilize them efficiently. We need to see the enhancement of performance of public institutions. We want good news stories. As much as the auditors love to talk about the bad, we want everybody else who has to talk about anything to talk about this good stories and the success. Of course, we want to see the enhancement of integrity of the public institutions, which talks to the culture and the movement, where we know that when we go to bed tomorrow, we wake up and everything is still going to be all right. And we want to strengthen public institutions that are here to serve citizens. We have a call to action, and we're following nicely with the provincial leadership to say that timing of oversight processes is critical, ensuring prevention of losses or harm, as well as timely recoveries. Oversight is therefore encouraged and is necessary. Please engage the accounting office and the executive authorities on the MIs, use the information in the audit reports, obtain insights, call in the Auditor General if you don't understand what's going on or you need additional insight, And in, of course, the local office, it would be Shireen and myself and Tracy. We are here to, of course, serve and assist you in terms of ensuring accountability. Monitor corrective action taken, engage the accounting officer on implementation of planned actions and recommendations, and where remedial action has been taken. Our message is clear. We want to accelerate accountability improvements. This will be done in 4 ways. We want to enforce performance measures for executive authorities, accounting officers, and accounting authorities. We want decisive coordination, monitoring, and correction on intergovernmental systems and processes must be effected without delay. This just means in fancy language that we want provincial government to assist local government. We want departments to assist each other. We want our state to progress to such a stage as that it can with the resources we have. We need sustainable solutions to prevent accountability failures, and we must be willing to invest in these and invest in the resources that are required to achieve this. And of course, for those departments and municipalities and public entities that are already there, we need to lead by example. We need to tell our peers what we're doing. We need to not just have 8 years of clean, but also how I as Treasury and COCTA have been able to assist my peers in terms of ensuring that there are consequences for accountability failures, that we acted swiftly, bravely, and consistently. We want to actively contribute to building a capable and development state that encourages a high adherence to ethics throughout society and a government that is accountable to its people. And we call on all executive authorities, accounting officers, officials, and other state institutions to join us in this. And thank you, Program Director. That is the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mafundla, for reminding us on what we should be doing and what we have been asked to do, let alone that we have sometimes had gaps in terms of doing what we are expected to do. And your presentation is coming at the right time. I see a number of leaders of local government that have just been elected recently. They are here in big numbers. And I think this is a very good start to ensure that in this term of local government, but as well as in the current midterm point of the provincial government, we recommit ourselves to the issues that we are raising here, that we need to be considering in terms of improving the integrity of public institutions and also ensuring accountability. You remind me of there's a part in the Bible, I don't know where it is by Bible, but Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego were summoned and asked a pointed question on whether it is deliberate on their part to worship God that is not worshipped in that particular area. But I like it like Muslim is toss. Abednego, Shadrach, now Meshach. I think we also deserve that pointed question as to whether it is deliberate on our part that after we have been told of the repeated findings and recommendations, but we continue to fail to respond to those, thus continuing with the trail years maladministration in certain areas and poor governance and accountability in the process. So I think we deserve that question since angabomna into bana sithi sixelele kodwa singade senze mahluko okanye sibe inactive in terms of dealing with these issues. I think you have ignited a lot of thinking on our part, Mr. Mabunda. Thank you very much. Without much ado, I'll request Mr. Advocate Chakavula to come in on behalf of the Asset Forfeiture Unit.
Thank you very much, Program Director. Premier of the Eastern Cape, Honorable Mr. Mabuyane, members of the Provincial Executive present, senior government officials, dignitaries from the municipal offices, Advocate Thuli Madonsela, colleagues from the Office of the Premier and sister law enforcement organizations, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Bongani Chakavula. I'm an advocate at the offices of the Asset Forfeiture Unit in East London. I will be very short. First, I would like to thank the provincial administration for their efforts to make this conference a reality. And today, being the International Anti-Corruption Day, the Eastern Cape government saw it fit to remember this day, thus affirming our collective commitment to save freedom and democracy by fighting corruption. They have realized that corruption endangers the very foundations of our democracy, and if not confronted, we indeed face the reality in which criminals would be in control and running the state apparatus. And once that happens, the future of our children and the aspirations of our people are dashed. It is indeed a time to act. We are encouraged to see that an anti-corruption forum has been formed, which is being managed from the Office of the Premier and which is comprised of dedicated professionals who are fighting corruption. We are currently working together with them in rooting out corruption. The Asset Forfeiture Unit is part of that fight to eliminate corruption, and the Asset Forfeiture Unit's formation is derived from the Prevention of Organized Crime Act, and which we name it POCA. So you would ask yourself, what is it that concerns POCA and the Asset Forfeiture Unit? Okay. POCA is an important piece of legislation that was enacted by the South African government. And this was done towards taking firm action against organized crime. It is also part of South Africa's response to the 40 recommendations compiled by the Financial Action Task Force on money laundering in 1990, which is an international instrument. So those 40 recommendations set out the basic framework for anti-money laundering efforts. And the aim of the signatories, of which we are, is to criminalize money laundering and make provisions for confiscation of proceeds of unlawful activities. So the aim of FAT, firstly, the aim of the international instrument was to limit secrecy within the financial sector or financial institutions, which means the banks and people used to use confidentiality, not for the law enforcement officers to get to their confidential information or bank statements. And this was created as an international framework wherein mutual cooperation between jurisdictions will inhibit international money laundering. It serves to implement That is our POCA, that is the Prevention of Organized Crime. It serves to implement the 40 recommendations in South Africa by introducing laws that criminalize money laundering activities and limiting secrecy. The fundamental purpose of the asset forfeiture that is, we as asset forfeiture unit, is to provide a tough measure to deal with crime, more specifically organized crime. And we know now that our courts have declared that POCA does not apply only to organized crime, it also applies to individuals, meaning that those who are involved in corruption in both private and public sectors, they are within our grasp. We know as well that some of the syndicates, they are massively resourced. So for us to deal with them and to disrupt them, then we need strong measures like POCA to deal with those syndicates. So asset forfeiture is the law that is used in addition to the criminal prosecution. It is aimed at taking profits out of crime. So the essential focus of asset forfeiture is financial disruption and taking financial benefit out of crime. Internationally, the trend is to focus on money, as it has become increasingly difficult to arrest, prosecute, and convict members of the crime syndicates, even those who are involved in corruption. There is therefore an increase in us as law enforcement agencies to focus on financial disruption of all syndicates, whether they are in private or public sector. And we also know that criminals are in it, or they are committing offenses because they seek to have high returns and risk, to make sure that their risks are lowered. So we know that these crimes are all economically motivated and they yield high returns. White-collar crimes, corruption, and money laundering, and all these crimes, people, they are in it for money. So it is there that the asset forfeiture can be used to be of help. We know as well that criminals are prepared to serve a term of imprisonment and they come back to enjoy their ill-gotten gains. And we have this situation that is now occurring where criminals use tactical continuous litigation to delay and subvert the ends of justice. It looks like, can I? My slide, it looks like my slide cannot be seen. I would like to
we can see it now.
You can see the slide.
Yeah, you can proceed.
Thank you. We see that there's a tactic that is being used these days, and this tactic is to continuously litigate, to delay and subvert the ends of justice, and This tactic as well, it needs to be financed. So imprisonment should therefore not be the only aim at rooting out crime. What we can do is to make sure that a term of imprisonment is given to an accused, and the accused as well is made to lose their possession. And this can deter the criminals because there will be no benefit from committing crime. So what's the purpose of POCA? The purpose of POCA is to ensure that criminals and those committing corruption do not profit from crime. And our duty is to take the profit out of crime. So people who are committing corruption lose their right to ownership of the property. That is the property that was used in the commission of the offense. Because profit is generally the motive for most of the crimes, and the asset forfeiture increases the risk for criminals not to enjoy their reward. And this reduces the incentive to commit crime. POCA as well makes provision for confiscation and forfeiture in respect of proceeds and instrumentalities of offenses. In POCA, we use two types of forfeiture mechanisms. The first one is the criminal forfeiture, and this one does not depend on a conviction at the end of the trial. We also use civil forfeiture where no conviction is required. So as we said that there are two chapters. The first chapter is chapter 5, which is based on criminal prosecution. So we are going to deal with that chapter 5, which is criminal forfeiture. This chapter, or this asset forfeiture, it runs parallel with the criminal prosecution, and it is aimed at freezing and forfeiting any assets that are held by persons charged with the offenses to the value of the benefit that they have received. So, but the focus here is on the person, that is the accused, as well as the benefit that that person has derived. And it means that even the assets that he had before he was charged, those assets are going to be forfeited because we are looking for the total of the benefit that person had received from the criminal activities. So what are the advantages of using this chapter, that is chapter 5? The advantage is that the value that is seized is the gross benefit. And what is meant by that? It means that we get the asset as well as its interest or the dividends that flow from the assets. That's the asset that is tainted. Also, you don't need to be in control of the benefit. The mere fact that that benefit passed through your hand, it is enough to hold that person liable and make sure that we take the proceeds of crime or proceeds of unlawful activities from him or her. This chapter also allows us to recover gifts. For instance, if you've given a gift to your relative within the period of 7 years, the gift that you've given to your relative, we can also recover it because it is presumed that it is the proceeds of unlawful activities. Another advantage is that the accused is forced to disclose all assets on an affidavit, and it's part of the confiscation inquiry. And the accused also pays for not disclosing the assets, because that leads to the contempt of court charges. The other way of fighting crime using Chapter 5 is use of the so-called presumptions. What are the presumptions? It means that, for example, if you have unexplained wealth, if you have unexplained expenditure, perhaps you use the money towards payment of your bond, or you received property that cannot be explained, it is presumed that those assets or wealth or expenditure, it came from the proceeds of unlawful activities, meaning that it is the presumption places you in a position where you can rebut that. So what does that mean? It means that the onus is on the accused or the defendant to prove that the assets that he has were legitimately purchased, and it means that there is a reverse onus, meaning it's not for the state, it's not for the NDPP to prove that the assets that you have were illegitimately obtained, but that the onus is on the accused or the defendant to prove that the assets were legitimately purchased. So the presumptions are also an effective tool of disruption of criminal enterprise. And all that we need is that a person should be charged with an insignificant offense to get the presumptions to work. So what about the overseas assets? We know that, for instance, that the receiver of revenue has the power of attorney to repatriate assets from foreign jurisdictions. That also applies to us. You are able to do that. You are able to repatriate assets from overseas. And as an example, I think it was this year that we had this 100 million that was repatriated from Israel. And that was the Bobroff case. So no assets can be hidden. We are able to trace and find them and repatriate them and bring them back to South Africa. So what about the victims, people who are victims of crime? We know that in poker, there is no specific provision for that, but that we are able to identify the victims and compensate them, and our courts have pronounced on that, and we recently have a judgment that recognizes that right to compensate the victims. So the victims must have suffered the direct financial loss, and that is calculated as the actual loss. So we were dealing with Chapter 5, and now we are dealing with Chapter 6. Chapter 5 that we're dealing with, it was criminally based, but this one is civil forfeiture, which is Chapter 6, which is civil based. And this chapter is not dependent on a criminal conviction. Even if the charges have been withdrawn, even if the person has not been charged, you are able to proceed, and it is in respect of an instrumentality of an offense and proceeds of crime or proceeds of unlawful activities, or both. What is instrumentality? If you use a vehicle, if you use your house, whatever property that belongs to you, you use it to commit an offense. That property is an instrument of an offense. For instance, if you use your house to sell drugs, you can take that house. If you use your car to commit an offense, you can take it because it is an instrument of an offense. And then proceeds also means assets that have been received in connection with unlawful activities. And civil forfeiture is concerned with property and is not concerned with an individual, because it's the property that we say that the property has been used wrongly, and so we target the property. So as I said before, it is about the instrumentality, and it is also about the proceeds of unlawful activities. So the aim here of an instrumentality of an offense is to taint the property of the assets, which means we are saying that the offense was committed, or it was assisted by the use of property. Proceeds of unlawful activities, that's the definition. It's any property, service, advantage, benefit, reward received or retained as a result of unlawful activities. So then we get to a forfeiture stage where the property is forfeited to the state. But what happens to the assets? The assets are paid into what is called a criminal asset recovery account. They call it CARA, and CARA is used by the law enforcement for law enforcement purposes, meaning that the monies that have been paid into that account, they are distributed to other law enforcement agencies to fight crime. So what it means is that the money that has been taken from the criminals is used to fight their activities. And sometimes if they are victims, then the victims are paid. So what are the consequences of POCA? It means that we are complying with our international obligation. It also means that we hit the criminals in the pockets. That is where it hurts most. And we let the criminals fund the fight against crime. Are typical assets that we have seized and forfeited to the state because they are proceeds of unlawful activities. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Advocate Chakavula. Are you done?
Yes, I am done.
Okay. No, thank you very much, Advocate, for sharing that information and the giving us a sense of what asset forfeiture unit is all about, and what we do about the proceeds and what do you usually target. And indeed would like to see more of that forfeiture of those assets in order for the public and the transgressors and those corrupt elements to stop doing crime. We need just action, and we want to see this more. Thank you very much once again. Without much ado, ladies and gentlemen, let me now request our keynote speaker, who does not need any further introduction, the former public protector, who really repositioned that office, not only nationally, but also continentally and globally, on the importance of the Office of the Public Protector. who has since decided to go to the academia to use the experiences that he has gathered during his her period in the previous work environment to generate knowledge. Without much ado, let me request Professor Thuli Madonsela to address the session. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you, Program Director.
You have muted yourself, Prof. Please unmute. Yes.
Thank you. Oh, it keeps.
You have muted yourself again. Please unmute.
That's.
Please unmute, Prof, and then move the cursor away from the mic.
Have that there's a counteraction that keeps. Hello?
Yes, we can hear you now. Why is it keeping on muting?
Deal with this because it's never happened before. Okay.
Yes, we can hear you now. We can proceed, Prof.
Thank you, Program Director. Thank you to the Premier of the Eastern Cape, Mr. Oscar Mabuyane, and the leadership of this province for this honor of addressing this event. And I would like to greet all of the honored guests as appropriately introduced by the Program Director. I was asked to really speak about the importance of lifestyle audits. And at first I was concerned, why would we only emphasize lifestyle audits when it is a systems problem? But having listened to everyone from the Program Director through the Premier to the last colleague that has spoken, it's very clear that the whole event has been properly and seamlessly programmed in such a way that it covers all bases. Next slide. All right, they have a slide here. Okay, can I share my slide if you don't mind? Okay, it's fine. We'll do it this way. We're meeting today on an amazing opportunity because tomorrow we'll be celebrating a globally celebrated constitution. Our constitution, as you remember, was signed on the 10th of December, and it has been acclaimed even after newer constitutions have been seen. For example, one of the people who applauded our constitution and recommended it as a model was
Colleagues, please, can we all mute?
Yes. So one of the people who applauded the South African Constitution and recommended it as a model was Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She said to the Egyptians, they shouldn't look at the American Constitution as a model, but rather at the South African Constitution because it covers all bases. It has a clear vision of society. It has clear entitlements for the people. It has very clear about the character of the state that needs to deliver. And it has very clear accountability mechanisms. And as we speak about corruption today, we can ground our conversation in this marvelous document that is the South African Constitution, because we can see when it talks about healing the divisions of the past and establishing a society that is based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights, that there's an element against corruption there, because one of the things that is undermined by corruption is equality. The fact that somebody else has to buy their way in through offering gratification as defined in the Prevention and Combating of Corrupt Activities Act of 2004, that means that that person will get an advantage over somebody who hasn't offered gratification, and that would be a violation of Section 9 of the Constitution, which is anti-discrimination. So even before you just talk about the money that is stolen by corruption, the accountability that is eroded by corruption, and everything good that is corroded by corruption, it is anathema to the social justice quest in the Constitution, and it is accordingly a violation of the right to equality. I already have indicated that we have one of the greatest constitutions in the world with a very clear vision of society. It also has goals which cannot be achieved if there is corruption. We have the goal of democratic values. The Premier and many others have spoken about state capture. One of the things whose heart are eaten by state capture is democracy. Because you cannot have democracy when the leaders in government are not acting in accordance with their party mandates, the will of the people, or even the objectives in the Constitution. They're dancing to the music of whoever has captured them, either through money or some other way of controlling them. And the policies they come up with are then not the kinds of policies that advance constitutional goals. They're not the policies that ensure that the Constitution is given life. Our Constitution has very clear values, and of course, those values include some of the values that have been discussed this afternoon, the value of accountability. Corruption corrodes accountability. The value of transparency. The interesting thing is that where there's no accountability and no transparency, corruption prevails. So there is a very symbiotic relationship between corruption and the absence of these values, but also it corrodes those values at the same time. Our Constitution has the Bill of Rights as the cornerstone of the democracy we're trying to build. And human rights are eroded when there's corruption. Firstly, because there's no money to pay for development, but also because others get an advantage that they do not deserve because they've bought it through some or other form of corruption. We have a constitution that defines the character of the state. Section 96 is about making sure that there's no conflict of interest between what you're doing as a member of the executive and the interests of the state. Section 217, as you know, is the procurement one, which is about an equitable, efficient, and effective system of procurement. And Section 195 gives us a sense of the values on which our democracy is supposed to be anchored on. And those values include high professional ethics. And of course, corruption prevails when there isn't a culture of ethics. And I was very happy that all of my colleagues have said the answer lies firstly in cultivating a culture of ethics, a culture of integrity, because that's how corruption ends up prevailing. I once attended a conference in the UK where, sorry, it was in the US, where a colleague from Holland or the Netherlands spoke like many of us about the kinds of cases they were dealing with. And the main case that he spoke about was the case where some guy stole money from a parking meter. And that was the scandal of the year. And when we all said, no, but please tell us about corruption, that's not even really corruption, it's just plain theft. And then he said, well, forgive me for the fact that I come from one of the least corrupt countries in the world. What you can see, though, between corruption and the broader societal lifestyle is that where there's generally a functional democracy, where there's relative equality, corruption generally is lower. And I'll come to that later. So why I'm raising this is because it's important that as we fight corruption, we fight it within the context of our broader constitution, understanding that this constitution has provisions that were chosen carefully so that they can fit in together. Where there's too many people who are left behind, a culture of corruption is easy to thrive. But as we fight corruption, we've got to fight it on the basis of what kind of society are we trying to build? Because if you ignore your navigator on your way to a novel destination, you will go astray. And that takes me to one of the factors behind corruption that have not been mentioned is my experience, both as a public protector and now as an academic whose research is grounded in social justice, which is advancing equality and ending poverty. I have found that the state is seen as a ladder towards sources of income, quick wealth accumulation, and just generally well-being. At the same time, we have a problem where the disruption of historical inequality keeps being subverted. And therefore attitudes towards corruption are not where they should be, because to fight corruption, those in government that are fighting against corruption need help from those outside. It's a matter that has to be tackled by a system, not by a few individuals. What is the moral lesson from this is that we need to make progress on social justice, on advancing equality and reducing poverty, so that corruption is not seen as a way into social mobility. And then people then turn a blind eye when the corrupt throw a few crumbs in their direction because they're looking at clean governance, but there's clean governance and my life is not going anywhere. And therefore then they support the bad guy, almost like having people supporting the mafia because it does bring Christmas presents to the grandmothers in the village. The second thing that I think we need to look at is corruption is not a victimless crime. A whole lot of people think that corruption is a victimless crime. And it becomes important, therefore, that we bring society into the party about understanding who are the winners and who are the losers in corruption. Everyone in this room knows that corruption corrodes all that's dear to a democracy or a group. It undermines sustainable development. It diverts trillions of rands and dollars away from public services. And when corruption is executed as state capture, corruption corrodes democracy, because basically you have a shadow government that is out there determining policies, determining the direction of government, when the parties are supposed to be determining that policy, and ultimately the people are supposed to be determining policy. So to combat corruption collaboratively, the UN, as you have heard, designated December 9 as a World Anti-Corruption Day. It is also principle number 10 in the UN Global Compact. Right. That takes me, dear colleagues, to lifestyle audits. My colleagues have already mentioned where lifestyle audits fit in within the whole ecosystem of combating corruption. So a lifestyle audit checks when our expenditure is reflected in your lifestyle is not aligned to your known income or wealth. So when there is that discrepancy between your expenditure and your lifestyle, chances are corruption or some other criminality is your source of income. And I do say chances are because not everyone who lives beyond their means is necessarily corrupt. It may well be that they won the lotto. It may well be that they have a blesser or something like that, or a sponsor. But what you want is then disclosure of why is there discrepancy. And normally they do this through something called a completeness test. And a completeness test will look at your sources of income, whatever they may be. Usually it would be your salary and any passive income that you have. And then say, let's say per month, you're receiving 100,000 rand from all of your sources of income. But monthly, they see nothing of your money going towards the fees of your children. Nothing is seen from your monthly income going towards your bond. Nothing is seen paying towards your car, your holidays, and other leisures, just your clothes. There just doesn't seem to be a match between what you seem to be spending and what you seem to be receiving. And of course, if you are a public servant or an employee of the state, you would have disclosed all of your sources of income. And if there isn't a match, then that completeness test will show that there is a lack of completion. And then you would be put on, you'll be required to account for the discrepancy. And if your story doesn't add up, you'll be held accountable. The one thing I would like to add, dear colleagues, about corruption and the completeness test or lifestyle audit is that it's not enough to just do a lifestyle audit of the employee and their underage children, which is the normal requirement, is that you should disclose sources of income your underage children. My experience as public protector is that people would appoint their sons and daughters to be proxies in a tender. So somebody is coming in with a tender, They then read the documents and then decide to give the tender to someone else. But that other someone else must go into business either with their children, or if they're not going to go into business with their children, they must subcontract their children or their girlfriend or something like that. So you have to, when you're looking at this completeness test, it's going to be important that you look at the spider web of crime. When we did the state capture investigation, at some stage we had a whole spider web that shows how these relationships connect. And when you do your lifestyle audit, you'll do that. For example, it doesn't make sense to have somebody, even if you're a minister, your salary is a fixed income, but to have somebody who has a girlfriend, in addition to a wife, who has a girlfriend who is living in a townhouse where there's rent, has been given a car, that immediately says to you, this person has other sources of income. Of course, it might be legitimate investments. That should be fine if it's legitimate investment, but they would have to account for that. But if they don't have investments that they've liquidated and they're not taking this money from their salary, and their department just issued tenders, you've got to ask for that. The other thing you also have to look at, dear colleagues, is gifts that are given by companies that have received tenders from the state. The money might not come written that the money came from the state, but it doesn't take a rocket scientist or an Einstein to see the link between somebody X, Mr. X getting a tender, and then Mr. X suddenly remembering that they like somebody important in government and they're going to give them a huge gift. And you've got to look at that, whether there wasn't overpricing. One of my discoveries, or our discoveries as a team at the Power Protector, was that in government, there was huge overbilling, huge overcharging, but sometimes total false billing, where the state is billed and nothing is delivered. So what looks like it's gifts that are being given to people is just money stolen from government. The UN says 5% of government money goes into corruption. That's not the case in South Africa, because people don't inflate the tender by 5%. You've seen that with PPEs. It's inflated by 1,000%. And then people in the value chain get the money. When we did Prasa, for example, there's a whole story there that you can see lifestyles, houses being bought around the same time as people are being given tenders. So it should be easy for the law enforcement agencies to come to the people and say, tell us, where did this money come from? Why did this person give you this huge gift? My last story is the story about a man who was a security guard at a very important company, and his job was to make sure that nothing gets stolen out of the company. And one day, a certain Mr. Dlamini walked, and no, it wasn't a Mr. Dlamini. Mr. Dlamini was the security guard. A certain John guy. John came pushing a wheelbarrow, and Mr. Dlamini, the security guy, asked, what do you have there? And John said, oh, no, I just have sawdust. What are you going to do with it? I'm going to make fire with it. That's day one. The security guy looked into the wheelbarrow, the sawdust, and really there was nothing stolen. Day two, same thing. The guy rocked up, asked, and the guy said it's sawdust. He checked thoroughly. There was nothing stolen. Day three, the same thing happened. By day four, the security guy asked John, say, I know you're stealing something. Tell me, what are you stealing? I'm not going to tell management. And the security guy, John said, oh, well, sir, I'm stealing wheelbarrows. This story is important about sometimes we get so bogged down on the detail that we miss the big picture. So as we're going to do these security these completeness tests, let's remember that it's not going to be a silver bullet, that corrupt people are criminals because corruption is a crime. It's the abuse of entrusted power for personal gain. They're always one step ahead of you. So the Public Service Commission says it's going to do lifestyle audits from February next year. A whole lot of things will be migrated and packaged differently. And please think about where the wheelbarrow is instead of just looking inside the sawdust, because we might not find anything in the sawdust, yet the state will not be functioning, which is why I truly like the idea of emphasis on creating a system or revamping the system that we have. In one of the training programs I attended that's called Sharpen Your Teeth, we were told that when it comes to wrongdoing, corruption, fraud, etc., you can divide people into 3 groups. 10% are people that will do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. They're internally or intrinsically anchored. 80% are going to do the right thing because they're afraid of being caught. That's the majority of the people. 10%, the lower 10%, are only going to do the right thing because there are guardrails. In other words, it's impossible to do the wrong thing, which says to me, we should look at how do we leverage technology to make it impossible for people to do the wrong thing. I sit in the Gauteng Ethics and Anti-Corruption Council, and we've been looking at a lot of cases where you are going to find corruption is where there's persistent violation of rules. So if we can use technology to make sure that the system cannot be overridden by people domestically, let's say where I'm sitting, I can't override the system where I am. It has to be overridden by somebody else. It will diminish corruption, but it will also ensure transparency because I will not be able to move until I've loaded certain documents that the system needs. The second thing that we probably need to consider is something that Dala Omar and I saw in Germany being done, especially now in the aftermath of state capture. This is important, is rotate your people. When people are corrupt, they corrupt everything around them. So if you fire the key guy who was corrupt, the people that that person had corrupted will remain in the system. But you now have a poisonous system because that person is going to be extorting them and saying they should do certain things, otherwise they'll be exposed. And that's probably why the system currently is experiencing high levels of corruption, because people are saying, oh, how come there's still more corruption? It's because we haven't cleaned the system, and therefore make sure that in areas such as procurement, when we do a certain course at Stellenbosch University that is called administrative law for state functionaries, we have found that in our research, the majority of corruption improprieties are in procurement. Then, of course, it's licensing and employment, etc. But if you fix procurement, not only are you fixing your system, you're also saving money so that you'll have more money to make the whole system work. And transparency, shifting people around and making sure that our eggs are never in one basket will make sure that we get a handle on corruption. We have a great constitution, but it is my honest belief that the lifestyle, the better life that is promised by the Constitution, where everyone's potential is freed and life improved, that life is on the other side of corruption. So if we get a handle on corruption, we're going to move. But we also have to move on social justice so that our people can join us in the fight against corruption. And I like the fact that my colleagues said the people should be part of the solution. Social accountability, they're the ones who know who's living beyond their means. It's just, even before we talk to whistleblowers, ordinary people can tell who's living beyond their means. So it's important that we work with them as part of the solution. I don't think we have until 2030, which is the SDG deadline, before we can quell the anger that is growing among our people who feel left behind. And part of the problem is because money is going away through corruption. But another problem is people can see the corrupt people flaunting their ill-gotten wealth, just strutting around, which makes people feel that it seems here that only wrongdoers thrive. If you do the right thing, you're not going to get anywhere. So we have to begin to see consequences for those who are corrupt. And we have to work with the people to make that happen. But Premier Mabuyane, distinguished guests, members of the Eastern Cape government, and all colleagues in this room, I do believe that by just starting to have this conversation on the 9th of December, which is Global Anti-Corruption Day, you're making a statement to the public that you want to lead when it comes to ending corruption. So we're not where we should be as a country, but summiting a great mountain begins with a commitment to start climbing. I know that because I've summited Kilimanjaro twice, and you, dear colleagues, are going to summit the mountain that is called corruption, just one hill at a time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. You can mute your mic, Prof.
Sure.
Thanks. Thank you very much once again, Prof, for the inspiring message and the angle that we have taken in terms of dealing with corruption. You know, giving us another perspective from which we should be moving to deal with corruption. So without much ado, ladies and gentlemen, I'm now open for any questions, comments to the speakers. Any takers? Are there any questions, ladies and gentlemen? I was once an educator, so as an educator, you don't have to see people lifting their hands. You are free to also to identify people to speak. Mr. Castanula, please shoot.
For this opportunity. I'd like to ask the professor something quickly. Greetings, Professor.
Greetings.
Thanks for such a very wonderful presentation. I'd like to hear from you, your take or your comment, or rather your opinion. What do you think the cryptocurrency, that the situation that is coming in, what is the impact of that in the current state of corruption? Like maybe I should put it to you this way. Do you think that if we are failing to address corruption at this point while we are still handling cash, maybe if we enter into the cryptocurrency space, do you think maybe we may even suffer more if we don't actually address the corruption now? Because it's actually easier to investigate cases when it's come to do with money, where it's easy to trace assets such as houses, shares, cars, and all these things. But with the coming in of cryptocurrencies, do you think that we can have even a worse situation if we do not address corruption and many other, tender-related corruption cases now? What is your opinion on that?
Thank you, sir. May I answer, Chair?
Yes, yes, Prof.
Thank you for that question. You're right that cryptocurrencies are likely to assist money laundering and obscuring the tracks of ill-gotten goods. However, blockchain technologies that were introduced around the same time as cryptocurrencies are also a better way of tracking everything. If, for example, you're procuring something, if you use blockchain technologies, you can tell from the word go where the goods originated and whether they were delivered. You can track them the way you track an Uber car right up to until it gets to your house. So it really is true, but our government, like many other governments, needs to begin to look at how to monitor and possibly regulate the use of cryptocurrencies to make sure that it's not a money laundering pipeline. But the same technologies can be used to enhance transparency and purity in the process, at least the blockchain technologies. A colleague of mine has done a paper around using blockchain technologies to improve procurement.
I see Mr. Skundla.
Thanks, Chair. Maybe let me just have one question. I've always observed that in other cultures, like the Muslims, they do keep large cash in their houses and do a lot of things with money that is large cash, which is sometimes as a result of business transactions that are involved in. And if you look in a number of areas, you would find that they are the ones maybe that support all the corrupt activities in some instances.